2008, I believe, in environmental engineering. So that's where I began my career, and kind of did a cooperative program for environmental engineering for about 5 years, and then immediately actually went into my master's degree in the Faculty of the Environment in climate change. And so I spent quite a bit of time at Waterloo, really focused on, I would say, bridging the gap or the connections between kind of technical engineers and climate and interdisciplinary needs to look at the climate crisis, and really trying to bridge those connections that need to be made. And back then there was, I would say, a challenge to really bridge those connections, and things have changed substantially. And I'm happy to kind of talk about those trends if you're interested. But I decided to kind of go straight from my undergrad into my graduate program, and get the MCC designation from the University of Waterloo, which is by design an interdisciplinary degree, which I found was really, really helpful to apply and really build on my undergrad in that time. And from there, really, that was about a year, and then kind of did a cooperative or practicum as part of my master's degree, which enabled me to kind of step my first foot into, I would say, my first, I don't want to say real job, but first position that allowed me to work in climate. I did do co-op throughout my undergrad as part of engineering, but those were typical engineering co-op jobs. And maybe I won't spend much time on those unless you're interested. But my first, I would say, kind of job that I really wanted to do was as part of my master's degree as a practicum. And it was actually as part of the Toronto and Region Conservation Authority. So in the second term of my master's degree, I applied to basically be a researcher at the TRCA, it's called, in the Toronto region. And really my role was climate-focused research in support of conservation science, which I didn't know anything about really beyond kind of having an environmental background a little bit from an engineering perspective. But I thought it was an interesting kind of first footing into my career. Really liked the idea of working locally somewhere to start and understand challenges. What are some of the municipalities and communities doing in the space of climate and environmental science? And so that's what I did. I started there on, I believe, a 4-month kind of contract, and then got extended to a second 4-month, and then basically got transitioned into a full-time position for about 5.5 years. And that's really where I started my career. Really unique role that I can talk more about and what I worked on. And the reason why it was unique is that I would say the conservation authorities in general transcend city and government boundaries by design, based on watersheds, based on how they manage ecosystems, which I thought was really interesting and a great excuse to get communities to work together. So there was a lot of the work that I spent doing was looking at, okay, how does this particular watershed, which covers not only the city of Toronto, but north of Toronto and west of Toronto, and sometimes east of Toronto and Durham region, and how do we really protect those lands, those waters? And so my very first project was looking at something called basically a climate change vulnerability assessment across watersheds in the kind of Toronto region, which at the time was really interesting and new. In the climate change world. There were some examples of that in the US, and some out in BC, and of course in Europe, but there hadn't really been I would say, a really comprehensive ecosystem risk assessment, is what it was called, in the kind of Southern Ontario realm at that point. And so it was really interesting to essentially create the approach that we needed to take to evaluate climate vulnerabilities on, not only trees and terrestrial systems, but also aquatic ecosystems, which is super different and complicated, and then how complex wetlands can be. So there was a lot of collaboration with the experts at the TRCA at the time, who were the ecologists, the biologists, and folks like that, and then kind of trying to synthesize, here's what the vulnerabilities are, and here's the so what, and the call to action for local government to really take and incorporate in terms of their plans and their decisions. I will say at that time, this was 2014, I believe, there was definitely some folks in government working on climate policy and climate planning. There were not that many focusing on adaptation, vulnerabilities, and risks, which was kind of what I was interested in pursuing. there had been quite a lot of work in the industry around mitigating climate change and the emissions, which I would say has always been kind of the big brother to the adaptation realm that I was interested in pursuing. But at that time, it was pretty nascent. And so it was a really small, close-knit group of people working on that issue at least across Ontario, if not across Canada in some ways. That has totally changed in the last 10 years. There has been an explosion of people working in climate adaptation in the municipal level, in the provincial and federal level. And I can speak more to kind of how that and why that's happened. And part of it is because of academic institutions and universities really embedding climate change into their programs and really getting folks better trained up and kind of showing that impetus for those positions. Really interesting start to my career at the TRCA, I would say. The other project maybe I'll just mention that I worked on, if that's kind of of interest, was I did a lot of work on flooding and flood protection for transit, which has kind of come full circle in the last couple of years with Metrolinx and the GO train. So about 10 years ago, I did kind of some flood mapping and flood assessments for Metrolinx to help them understand where their rail corridors were at risk. Again, worked with all the experts in the Toronto Region Conservation Authority who knew the models, who knew the assessment process, and collaborated with the Metrolinx kind of government agency and developed an entire adaptation strategy with them, which is public and it's quite interesting and it's quite a good document. But of course, 10 years later, we've seen significant flood impacts again in many of the same areas. So there's been a lot of really interesting lessons learned from kind of looking at it and understanding where those risks are and seeing the lack of action that hasn't really been taken over the last 10 years and seeing kind of similar, if not quite literally the same impact in some regions for their trains. So that's just another kind of cool project that I was involved in. I decided to ultimately kind of move on from TRCA after about 5.5 years. There was a number of changes happening at that time at the local level, in part because of a new provincial government coming in and really changing the mandate of conservation authorities to be streamlined specifically to flooding and to traditional authority kind of things. So then I moved into more of a, I would say, consulting role. And I joined an organization that was an engineering consulting firm called GEI. Was called something different at the time, but every consulting firm gets bought out by another consulting firm. So at that time, my role really was supporting municipal governments and local governments on the same thing, on climate change, on looking at how do we assess climate risks, what does that mean, how do we create a plan, and what do we really do to incorporate climate into our infrastructure management, our infrastructure systems. And in that role, again, much of the same work that I had been doing at the TRCA was kind of continued and grown upon. And I worked in different local governments across North America doing similar exercises. So risk assessment, climate-related planning, and across different systems. So not just for ecosystems and flooding, but in this case, it was more on infrastructure, so roads, municipal assets like facilities or courthouses and things like that. So kind of expanding my experience from local-based kind of watershed science and ecosystems to more of the infrastructure. And then I got an amazing opportunity to essentially work on or work with a nonprofit institution called the Climate Risk Institute, specifically to to support the delivery of the Ontario Climate Change Risk Assessment, which was a 2-year project. And as part of that role, again, very heavily involved in looking at climate change, but this time across the entire province, across kind of 5 different major themes and assessment areas, and working with the Doug Ford government on a lot of policies and challenges that they didn't want to pursue. So there was a lot of really interesting lessons learned there around how do you work with governments who don't see climate change as a priority, and how do you frame some of this research? And there was a lot of, I would say, really meaningful engagement with partners across the province, really interesting deliverables, and a ton of information came out of that. And some of which is public now, some of which is still not public, but there's been a lot of kind of follow-up from that as well. So happy to speak more about that. But that was really my first kind of experience taking a step up from local to more provincial, like working at a broader system or a broader scale, and seeing how do you really do this within a reasonable amount of time, detail to really accomplish something. And my first foray into working with, I would say, more of a staunchly different type of political government, as opposed to kind of local governments, which are really focused on services, delivery, and things like that. And so I really appreciated that time at the Climate Risk Institute, it was called. And the other kind of part of my role at that time was helping training for engineers, and really delivering some courses and some workshops with predominantly local engineers and infrastructure folks, but helping them understand, here's why you need to look at climate change, here's how you can incorporate climate into your infrastructure projects, and then here's where you can go for some of the resources that are being developed. And it was around that time where there was a really big uptick in momentum in the industry for climate. You saw a lot of local government and provincial governments across Canada hiring for climate-related roles, whether that was coordinators, researchers, project managers, more senior directors, folks like that, and really seeing a big momentum pick up in the adaptation space, which is super exciting. I've always been kind of waiting for adaptation to take off, and it still needs to kind of grow even further, of course, but that was really around the time, after about 6 or 7 years being in that space, where it really, I noticed a bit of a difference, and really seeing some capacity being built internally at these different organizations, because the solution really can't be always relying on consultants or always outsourcing these things. We need to be building people who know what they're doing or interested in it internally, wherever they are, in the government, in provincial agencies, et cetera, in private sector. One thing maybe I'd add is that even in the private sector, they've struggled to hire climate-related people who they have the right experience or who have the right interest or fit as part of a particular role. And that's been a big lesson learned, I think, on the private sector side, is when you want someone who can focus on climate resiliency or risk for whatever their particular mandate is, it's not always as easy as you might think to find them. And that was the case 5+ years ago, and that is definitely changing now. But that has been their experience, is how do you staff up with the right people and who have that right level of experience. And then from my previous position, I actually moved into a very different type of organization, which was called Jones Lang LaSalle, which was a very large multinational global real estate firm. And I did so for a couple of reasons. It is a very large, so it's a Fortune 100 company. I can't recall how many people they have working for. Over 100,000 people work for this company. So it is a giant international real estate company. My role in that organization was to lead climate resilience kind of across North America as it relates to JLL, which was a totally different role, kind of coming from a kind of local nonprofit think tank into a kind of global real estate, private sector heavy firm. And I did that for 2 reasons. It was quite controversial at the time when I actually made that move among my friends and my family. The reason I did that was twofold. The first was I really wanted to learn how to communicate with people who weren't in public sector on climate risk and climate change. So how do you sell this to people who are investor focused, who only care about payback periods or return on investment, for example? Totally different conversation when it comes to adaptation and climate change action than if you're talking to someone who works in a government whose job is to deliver better for their residents and for Canadians, for example. So I learned a ton of really trying to sell that and meeting them where they're at, and also pushing them to go further. So my role really was to, I would say, kind of coordinate and support across a number of projects in North America. So a lot of work on climate change risk assessment and plans, and really supporting the business case for implementation for real estate. So for private sector infrastructure, so office, all the exciting stuff, offices, in some cases, condo buildings, multi-story residential buildings, sometimes supporting municipal government facilities, but basically private sector infrastructure. I spent 2 years in that role. I really liked it, but I found over that 2-year period, again, changes in terms of how they were focusing on climate risk, even at the global level at the company, were shifting. And I can speak more to kind of what that was. But I found that I was really interested in understanding how to make a big impact, specifically for the broader sense, for not only private sector infrastructure, but for infrastructure systems as a whole. Whereas at JLL, my role was focused entirely on private sector investment and working with investors. So when you hear that, it is absolutely the investors you'd hear on the news, BlackRock, these major asset managers that are not known for their environmental sustainability reputations for their work. Some of them are more leading than others, absolutely, especially in Canada. And so it was really interesting to work with those that are more leading versus those that are more, I would say, learning or challenging themselves as to whether they should even be looking at climate. My role itself was kind of on a team that was focused on climate change and kind of decarbonization or mitigation work to support across North America. But one thing I found interesting in the kind of big private sector corporate world is that they still include climate change as part of ESG, as their realm of sustainability. So environmental, social, and governance kind of efforts. And so I found myself having to kind of learn new alignment or new links between what I know from climate change and engineering and environment to this new term of like ESG and ESG strategy for corporations. And that was a really big learning curve. And ultimately, what I decided is that I'd rather be doing climate change focused work that's dedicated for residents, for Canadians, for infrastructure, as opposed to kind of it being one component of an ESG strategy. And that's why I'm currently in my latest role, which is at Housing, Infrastructure and Communities Canada. And I'm a senior advisor kind of on climate and capacity building. So my current position, it's exactly as it sounds. I provide kind of senior advice and recommendations, policy analysis, and kind of critical insights around all infrastructure and how do we really accelerate better climate-informed infrastructure development, management, including housing, which is a huge, huge priority and crisis right now for the federal government. So the ministry I'm at right now is HICC, and it includes the housing mandate now across the government of Canada. So we are constantly thinking about how do you include climate change into all these different types of infrastructure while not hindering its accelerated need for development or construction, for example. So that's my current role. I've been in this position for just about 4 months now, I believe. So not long, but learning a ton, and very interesting time to be in the federal government as well, of course, recognizing that we will be facing a federal election in the next year as well. So I think part of my previous experience has really helped me set myself up for a little bit of that in terms of frame what you're doing for a lens that may be different or may need to change or may need to be reflected in a different way. So I think a lot of focus lately in the last 4 months at my job has been on creating a bit of something called the capacity building strategy across the country, and really thinking about, okay, how do we support local government and communities that are smaller, more rural, more remote, more Indigenous, more in the north, for example, that don't have the same level of capacity to prioritize or to implement infrastructure to the way that they need to. Some of them are obviously just trying to address the housing crisis or just have basic necessities they have to deal with. So trying to navigate that in the federal government has been a brand new challenge. And I will not say that I'm well versed for that yet, but I'm something I'm actively learning and collaborating with across different folks in the government. So that brings me to today. So I'm happy to speak more about any of those particular positions or projects or roles that I've had, if that's of interest. But I'm also happy to answer any questions you might have around, career development, networking, etc. So maybe I'll pause there. Unless there's any kind of follow-ups or clarifications you'd like to hear, maybe I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Glenn, for that wonderful overview of your journey thus far. And it's really cool to hear about how you plan those different career moves in an intentional way around, what you want to learn, the kind of experiences you want to gain. Yeah, super, super helpful, I think, for a lot of our students as they kind of try and figure out what their journey is going to look like. So folks, if you do have questions, we've got a good amount of time, really up until 2:00, to have some back and forth. So feel free to come off camera and ask the question, come off mute or put a question in the chat. But I can kick us off with some questions that were pre-submitted while we give you folks some time to think. So there was a question about advice around transitioning into a career in sustainability and just the kinds of transferable skills, or I guess the core skills that would benefit somebody looking to be in this space. Yeah, it's a little bit, maybe a little bit of a broad question, but if there are kind of core skills maybe from school that you feel like you've held on to or that you've really developed and you're like, oh yes, this is essential to doing well in this space. Maybe you can shed some light on that, Glenn.
Yeah, and I definitely think, and that has definitely been part of the change in the last kind of 5 to 7 years, is not only has there been new people coming out of school focused on studying climate or a particular aspect of climate change, there's been a whole ton of people who've transitioned from other careers coming into the space who are passionate about it from all different backgrounds, from planning to education. Actually, I work with someone who's from in education, who used to be a teacher for 20 years, now working in climate at the federal government. So there's all sorts of these kind of shifts into the space, which is so exciting to see. I would say some of the transferable skills, like for example, if you're in teaching, educational, aspects of your work, there's a lot of things you can really apply to climate as well that are interdisciplinary, and those things could include, focusing on engagement and supporting, the development of workshops, for example, with staff. There's a huge need for engaging community as it relates to climate change assessment, planning, and that's a specific skill set to be able to understand, okay, how do we communicate in plain language that's not technical at the right level, but also in the right format that is quite close, for example, to how you'd run a course or in the classroom. And that is something that you'd never want an engineer to lead a workshop like that. And so even I would say I'm happy to present at an event like that, but I don't think I'm the best suited to plan it or organize it. So some of the transferable skills would be like, how do you really distill down into the key messages? What sort of structure or format would be helpful for engagement? And more broadly, having some of those, I would say, non-technical skills that can really help move things forward internally is a huge need. In every organization I've had, it's how do you really meet people where they're at? And I think there's a lot of skills that aren't in the traditional climate science and engineering kind of degrees more formally that actually are way better suited for that. Planners are a different example and a completely different kind of background that have a very unique kind of focus on how they approach something and from a longer term. So it's always been very interesting to me to have a workshop, for example, with engineers and then have a second workshop with planners. Conversations totally different. The engineers will focus on something very tangible, practical. They want to talk about like a building or a road. Whereas if you talk to planners, it's hard to follow some of how complex they can think. It's quite interesting and fascinating. And so they're decades ahead sometimes in terms of how they're thinking about growth targets and development and planning and accommodating. And their questions are usually, how do we incorporate climate to buffer the impacts of some of the things we need to do to ensure we build housing, for example? So it just depends on your passion. I actually had a conversation with someone a couple of weeks ago who works in senior living care. Like she does kind of facility management and supports senior living centers in Michigan. And she was really passionate about making a shift into climate change, and was just wondering about how do I really tie what I've been doing to more of that climate change role. And I think the question I usually always ask is, well, what type of climate role? Because there's so many now. Would you like to work locally, more broadly, or globally? And how do you really kind of get into that space? And because there's so much need on a number of courses you can also take, or kind of freely available resources you can read to get more familiar with climate as well. So it's not necessarily a barrier if that's something you're passionate about, to make more of that shift into the science side as well.
I love that you mentioned how, yeah, planners can think so intricately and think about those complex systems. And maybe we have some planning students in the room right now. Yeah, I thought that was really great.
Some of the most complex people I've ever had to have a workshop with. Really fascinating. Yeah.
Chris.
Yeah, can I have a follow-up question on that? That's that's very cheerful message. For example, my example is I just graduated from Master of Climate Change program, which is more like an interdisciplinary program, right, course-based, but I had no technical background related to environment or climate change science or whatsoever. I came from like more like a business side, business strategy planning and business development. So what kind of roles you mentioned about these transferable skills, right, are also essential in driving those actions or but what kind of roles do you see in these organizations? Because when we look, personally, when I was like doing the job search, it seems that all these companies are requiring like technical background, especially consulting firms or yeah.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I would say that, and still today, I would say a lot of the climate change roles that exist or that are kind of out there are not as publicly shared as they should be through like job boards or through online search forums. A lot of it's through networking, to have to communicate with, kind of connect with people and understand, could there be a fit or a reason to create a role? But there are definitely roles. You're right. I think a lot of the ones that are posted are even available in the private sector have like, you shall be technical in some way, shape, or form, and be kind of a climate change specialist, for example. There are roles that focus on more business development, if that's something that's of interest for, let's say, consulting firms. There are roles that would be climate change focused, for example, if that would be a passion. It's definitely not an area I kind of excel in, is kind of that business development and growth side, but that's a huge focus in the private sector as well. I would say there's also quite a few roles in the local governments for climate change policy and climate coordinators that don't necessarily need planning, or engineering. Like you can come in, for example, from, I've seen people like with backgrounds in emergency management, which is not so much technical, it's more training, for folks like that. I've seen kind of people come in from education backgrounds as well. So I would say it might, and those are obviously harder to land, those local government jobs, because they tend to be pretty competitive, but those are another example, like a coordinator position type of thing. But the other idea could be kind of in a think tank nonprofit organization. There's a number of these regional climate organizations across Canada, including the one I worked at, like CRI, and even having an internship with them to kind of get your foot in the door and say, hey, I've worked in climate change in a dedicated focus, for whatever that organization may be. There's like 6 or 7 of them across Canada. That could also be helpful, because then you can kind of make a step from there, either to stay or to go somewhere as a follow-up. But I think you're right. If you're kind of focused on looking at kind of a typical private sector climate change posting, a lot of them will have like, you should have a PN or something, you should have a degree in whatever. So I would say the other way around that is to try to kind of connect with folks in the industry and say, do you know someone who might be hiring? And could we even create a role, or apply for funding to create a role? That's how actually TRCA hired me. They applied for funding to share my kind of salary for 4 months, and then they decided to pay the full amount after those 4 months. So I think connecting directly can also help.
That's very helpful. Thank you very much. I actually have another question, but I'm not sure whether we have time or.
Yeah, we have time. We have time. Yeah, go ahead.
Speaking of nonprofit organizations, I noticed there are so many nonprofit organizations like working the climate change space, especially in like in the empowering local governments or organizations, right? I'm actually quite curious. I think for many government officials or other even for professionals, there are so many to work with or to choose from, right? So do you see there is a trend or potential for these nonprofit organizations to consolidate, or because in the private sector we see lots of this happening, right? There's lots of industrial consolidation. I'm not sure about the nonprofit sector. What's your view on that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say it does depend on where you are in the country. Like for example, if you're out west or in the north, there's a handful. Like you clearly know the 2 or 3 major nonprofits that are working in the space, and some are climate science focused, doing products and modeling, and some are like empowering local government. So like 1 or 2, for example. We like to call Ontario the Wild West when it comes to this type of stuff, because there's so many nonprofits in Ontario and the Great Lakes region. And when I was in consulting, I remember like some of the nonprofits consult as well. They actually do fee for service work. They apply for the same types of projects that consultants do. And so I would say there's definitely some, I don't want to say turf wars, but territory there that they collaborate, but sometimes also compete on similar types of work. I do think slowly over time, there'll be some consolidation or endorsement in some of the organizations. Like that is something at the federal level that they're always asking about is which are the core sweet regional organizations that should be our hub in the prairies or the north or Ontario, and for what, right? But I think there's still a lot of these that have cropped up, partly funded by private, partly kind of created and kind of chased their own funding. And it's quite confusing for folks who haven't worked in the space. They did get kind of created to fill a need, and some of them are research focused, and that really wasn't an option, 10 years ago. So I think there was that added value. And I do think over time, you'll see some consolidation or perhaps collaboration more formally between the organizations, those that have, for example, more funding and those that may need to kind of shift and then partner with others to kind of continue. I don't think it will be as substantial as consulting firms, though, where there's like, you're getting monopolized with kind of the big 4 or 5. I don't think it'll go there. But I was at a workshop about 7 years ago in Ontario where they were talking about collaboration between all different nonprofits and consultants in the kind of space in climate. And the preference in general across the room was we'd like more formal ties, like formal collaboration. Like we don't want this to be all of us independently just trying to keep the lights on and stay in business. We want to be able to find more sustainable funding and create more of a consortium type of approach. So I would say hopefully there'll be some consolidation to support those groups too, but not too much consolidation.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, no problem.
Yeah, that's a great question. And that piece on consolidating and like being able to do more together is something that I think even the University of Waterloo is thinking about in terms of all the different institutes that we have and research labs and centers, and how do we streamline them so that also the public isn't confused about all these different
sometimes it's just so difficult to navigate. Like there are many organizations providing very similar
support or research.
Thank you for sharing your insight.
Oh, no problem. I think that's a universal experience too, even in some government, like certainly in the federal government, is trying to figure out how do you coordinate and really leverage and build capacity better between different groups, because there is some overlap that's trying to be solved, right? Like we need to have those ability to be more efficient and ultimately leverage each other's work, as opposed to kind of having to figure out who's doing what and perhaps having some overlap in some areas. But some of the places also do very unique things. And that's why it's challenging. Like some, for example, are very, very focused on insurability and amazing research around insurance and homes, which others don't do, right? So there is some unique aspects to that you don't want to get rid of. Yeah.
All right. I'm not seeing any questions in the chat, but folks, don't be shy to come on camera if you do have a question or pop it in the chat. I know that the topic of kind of networking and using your network has come up a little bit now, and there were a few questions about networking that were pre-submitted, especially for introverts. And I'm curious, Glenn, the concept of networking, was that something that were you always good at using and leveraging your network? And like, how have you gone about that in the past? And what have your learnings been around that to become more comfortable with it?
Yeah, I would say I also considered myself more introverted. I'm actually a terrible in certain situations. So I would say that that was probably the biggest, when I was first looking at an opportunity, my first opportunity coming out of my master's degree, I deliberately kind of focused on a job that would help me build a network or where I could meet a lot of people. So at the TRC, I was like, maybe I'll be able to meet a lot of people in government, or at least who work locally, who could then help me connect afterwards or during the work. I've always found it much easier to network after I have like a working relationship with someone, or we have a project together, or we work together. It just creates an easier way to kind of create an introduction or say hi. So that was really the first thing, was kind of thinking about that first step and saying, okay, this could help me grow where I want to kind of be longer term, in the kind of Southern Ontario area. That I know a lot of folks from my class, for example, in my master's degree, decided to take jobs internationally, and stayed there because that's where they built their networks, right? So that was a bit of a deliberate choice for me. Some people have phenomenal jobs in where they are, which is really cool to see as well. So kind of thinking about where do you kind of maybe want to grow, and meet people, is a helpful way of framing. But I would say the networking side of it is challenging, especially for people who are, I mean, it's like for me, for example, my worst type of networking situation is in like a post-conference networking event where there's like an hour and a half. There's like, here's your conference and networking event. Everyone's going to be there. You really need to be doing business development, or you need to be connecting with people who are in the industry. And I've been in a number of jobs where your job is to just meet people and bring back leads or opportunities to connect and work together on. And that's one of my worst nightmares. Still, I don't find that comfortable. And I would say I'm much better one-on-one when someone reaches out through a coffee chat, or when I can do that with them, where I'll maybe send an email, reach out over LinkedIn, reach out through another connection I have. That I'm quite comfortable kind of sending an email and kind of creating a bit of a virtual chat. But I would say the challenges I've continued to face is when I have a big event like that, I don't like kind of interjecting into a conversation cold. And so that has been something that to this day I actively work on. It's how do you feel if I'm still not comfortable with that? But what are some of those icebreakers you can have, in those moments? Can you go with someone if you're at the event with who can help you? Some of the people I've worked with are incredibly extroverted, and I have no idea where their energy comes from. And so if you can find someone you can kind of go with and who can break the ice, I find that also really helpful. But I think it's more about finding the formats or the methods that work for you, whether that's emailing, requesting virtual chats, even just kind of connections through a friend. Maybe you don't start at and it put less pressure on yourself at some of these conference events, which is something I continually tell myself today. But you don't have to go in there and kind of feel like you've met every single person. If you can kind of meet one or two people, that's also really successful. So I think kind of knowing how to navigate those different situations is helpful too. But I don't have any silver bullets because I would say that is still my number one challenge, is going to a conference and meeting. I know people who can meet tons of people at those events, and I'm not one of them.
I'm totally with you, Glenn. I also prefer the one-on-one, or the small groups, and find just, wading into a sea of random strangers to be deeply uncomfortable. But I love that, the kind of bring a buffer or bring sort of like a wing person, to to go through that experience with you. And also I'd add, like the whole, it's so much easier to build the connection when you've worked with someone on a project, or there's a mutual friend that can kind of can make an introduction for you, that you can work through. And even volunteering. I know a lot of our students are super engaged. So if you're a part of industry organizations, or volunteering with nonprofits in the sector that you kind of might want to work in, that's also a really great way to build connections. I know that's been helpful for me in the past as well. We still have about 15 minutes left for questions. So again, folks, feel free to pop on, or put a question in the chat if you have anything in mind. I do have another question that was pre-submitted, just on advice for making the most out of your time in university, and kind of getting the most out of your degree. Like, were there kinds of things, or maybe groups you were involved in, or maybe ways you connected with your profs, whatever it is, what are the things that you're like, oh, I'm glad I did that, that really, helped you through your time at Waterloo?
Yeah, that's a great question. I did do, in my undergrad, I did join a bunch of different kind of organizations and clubs on campus, almost not as like I would say not as an escape, but like as something totally different and refreshing, which I found really helpful. So I joined a lot of the a cappella groups on campus, which was a huge thing back in the day. And I loved doing that for 4 or 5 years. It was a really great way to meet people who were totally non-technical, and just have more developed friendships that way. And that really helped me kind of I would say get out of some of the stress in my undergrad, especially in engineering, which was quite intense. So I think that was the first kind of thing, was kind of, if you can spare some of the time, it really is valuable to meet people from different degrees or different kind of organizations that are on campus. That was one thing I found really helpful. In terms of connecting with profs, I found that easier actually as I got into like second, third, and fourth year, when I got into doing more of the lab work and some of the research work. So my master's, for example, when I was reading some of the different papers around climate change and vulnerability for communities, I'd often kind of go or send an email with a question to my prof and kind of say, hey, I'd love to just learn more about your experience doing this, or creating some of those opportunities for conversation with profs was a great way of doing that. And same thing in my undergrad. If I was in, for example, doing a research study or a research paper or a lab work thing, that was also a really good opportunity to have some more time to build a relationship with a prof, or with other people not in a classroom setting. And so I would say that's another aspect that could be, of interest, that I found that for me there was just more space, and less kind of formal, you have to listen to everything, and digest everything, and you can just kind of have more of a human conversation. But definitely I would say the clubs on campus, and kind of getting yourself out of maybe the kind of core focus of your day-to-day, with other ways, whether that's groups, organizations, volunteering, I think really helped me kind of just reset and refresh a bit. Yeah, probably leave it at that.
I am so excited to hear that you did a cappella. And now I feel like we should have had you sing to us. No, I'm kidding.
Actually, the a cappella groups I was involved in, like way back in the day, from like 2009, they're still there in their name and their brand.
Have some groups, yeah.
But a lot of the people I sang with back then, are in Toronto, and for a while pre-COVID, we also kind of informally still sang together, which was kind of cool. I mean, COVID really disrupted that. But for several years after graduation, we still kind of connected and stayed together, which was cool to see.
That's so fun. Oh my gosh. Yes, we even have some folks on our advancement team who are part of regional a cappella groups. So yeah, it's such a fun way to make really good friends. And Chris, I just saw you came off mute, so go ahead.
Yeah, I can I have ask another question? Yeah. You mentioned about the interesting aspect of at a JLL, right? You said that it was kind of a surprise for you that the climate change role actually is part of ESG, and then it was kind of a learning curve for you. Can you elaborate that a little bit? Like how was your role like differentiate from the other ESG, like the other team members, and probably also like what is the team composition in the overall ESG, and what were the roles and what were the team doing? Kind of that, just to get a better understanding.
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say, so in my role, I would say globally, at the highest level at a company like JLL, they have kind of regional teams. So they have North America, they have an Asia Pacific, they have a Europe team, they have a Middle East kind of team, then they have a Latin America team. Not all are the same. And they're kind of created, the ESG and kind of sustainability and climate people differ depending on where the market is in the private sector. So for example, at JLL, Europe, of course, had 5 climate people. North America had 2 that were dedicated fully on climate and specific, I would say, strategy elements of climate change that I was doing. I would say Latin America had 0. Asia Pacific had 1. So it really just depends on the markets and kind of how much work they were able to really support with their clients and their other kind of asset managers. I should kind of caveat that and say that there are specific roles in that private sector organization where there are 75 people just doing energy engineering, or 20 people doing strategy for sustainability goals, like ESG strategy. So it does depend on what you want to do and what those services are. But I'm speaking specifically to climate change jobs. But generally, I would say regionally, the team composition changed depending on their market maturity. Europe was the first and ahead in many ways, and followed by a lot of the climate work in North America. And my passion while I was there was trying to get Latin America up further to speed to hire climate people. And they finally did hire 1 climate person who's still there in Mexico City. And so it does depend on kind of what you are doing at an organization like that. But JLL also has a global team that focuses on kind of their own corporate, so socially responsible ESG kind of reporting. And in that team, they have one climate director. So it just depends on kind of what aspects of the work you'd be doing. In the North American team where I was, it was, I would say, a lot of working with energy specialists to help buildings, for example, save or retrofit on certain things, and working with the different people who own the buildings, or working, I would say, with the global team on, for example, products, technologies that are interesting to invest in. So one of my parts of my role was evaluating some of these climate technology companies that have exploded in the last 3-4 years, some of which are very, very interesting, very expensive to procure and work with, others that are very, very different and are much more open source or trying to be freely available, but that have methodology differences. And so part of what I was involved in was also evaluating some of the different data sets and tools that a company like JLL could use. Part of what I was pushing for internally there, and I'm still pushing for with the government of Canada, is like, where is our FEMA equivalent data sources and data sets? Like if you go to the US, where they have their Federal Emergency Management Agency, they have a lot of climate change resources that are publicly available, quantitatively developed in terms of financial data. They have something called the National Risk Index, for example, in the States. They also have a number of private sector companies in the US that have publicly available climate risk scores for your house. So you can put in your address and you can find your level of risk for heat, wind, flooding, etc. That is something that Canada is at least a decade behind it, at least. And I told that to my director general, is that we are well behind on that. And there is some active work on that. But while I was at JLL, that was something I was also advocating for, is trying to find some sort of global internal tool that could support everyone in the organization, including, I would say, working with some of the oldest school type of people, like brokers, real estate brokers. JLL is, of course, a massive real estate company. So one of their biggest kind of groups is the people who buy, sell, and lease real estate. And getting through those folks on climate and sustainability was some of the hardest internally, kind of try to kind of connect with what they're doing, which really is just buy, sell, profit margin. And trying to get them to care about, hey, if you retrofit, if you reduce your emissions, for example, you'll see actually a cost saving and perhaps a return when you lease, for example, in 5-10 years from now. And making that business case was something that was a big focus from, I would say, from across North America. But connecting with the people who are older school can be challenging. So I'm sure that's still a struggle they're having. But they did invest in a tool for climate, internally for climate data at JLL. So I would say that it was very interesting. At a company like that, it's so large that it's hard to really explain the different teams and dynamics. But I would say it was really organized regionally, with one global team kind of doing the coordination on the climate.
Yeah, that was a very helpful introduction. I think I started to realize, okay, the global team might be just managing about, okay, how as a corporation JLL is doing in ESG, right? They probably be responsible for issuing the ESG reporting, those things, while your role at the regional level probably is more like related to business.
Yes.
How
Market,
you incorporate that into the products, the solutions that you will provide to the clients.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. That's very good to know.
Yeah, and I would say I suspect some of these other big Fortune 100 companies are similar in terms of how they're structured. It does depend on the market. And so some markets ebbed and flowed. Like I know the Latin American market was quite small when it came to sustainability, just because of some of the essential infrastructure needs they had in the private sector. But the North American market, for example, Canada was exploding with growth in a good way when it came to sustainability and climate goals and supporting all the products and services. The US was already so large that they were struggling to continue to grow, to continue to stay their status quo. So it does depend on where you are, kind of the momentum, and we are going to see huge changes in the US and in Canada in the coming years, I suspect. And so kind of being able to ride out those changes is a huge part of the private sector climate.
I think that has a lot to do with the regulatory context as well, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, very good to know. Thank you.
you for all your wonderful questions. Love engaged students. And I know, Chris, you've been to a number of our alumni office hour sessions, so I remember your face.
I always benefited a lot.
Oh, I appreciate you. We have about 6 minutes left, folks. So if you have any burning questions, now is your time. But I thought it might be good if there's any examples, Glenn, of lessons you learned the hard way along the way. And if there's nothing that comes to mind, no worries. But I know that sometimes for our students, there can be a lot of anxiety about making the wrong move or not wanting to make mistakes or, fear of failure. And I know we try and say that it's not really a failure as long as you learn something from it. But maybe there's a way that you can kind of, I don't know, shed light on you're just another human too, and we all go through those challenging moments, and maybe some words of comfort and how you got through it would be
Yeah,
helpful to
absolutely.
listen to
Yeah.
students.
I mean, and tons of examples of that, of course. I mean, maybe in my very first, I'll give you one of my very first job at the TRCA, when I was in kind of a climate change team doing a lot of the research and support for local governments, I had the opportunity to connect with Metrolinx, which is the transit agency, just through a connection I had and someone I worked with very closely. So at that time, for example, I sent an email, I reached out, and I tried to just explore, are they interested in looking at climate and flooding for their mandate? Really great opportunity. I thought, it'd be something I could easily help bring in and really, create a good relationship with the TRCA. And at the time, I didn't kind of necessarily understand or think about how the relationships really worked with TRCA and Metrolinx at the time. And so I kind of got my wrist slapped by the engineering team, which had such a very, very important, powerful relationship with that organization. So that's a kind of an easy example of, like, I sent an email. I was really, really excited about kind of creating something that I could, explore, bring in, build on. And they were like, absolutely not. I had to go back and forth and kind of work with internal folks first and then kind of reapproach. And to this day, the engineering director doesn't love me at TRCA, but we still have a good working relationship. But that was one lesson learned, I would say. But again, no burned bridges at all. Even in kind of the number of times I've shifted in my positions, in my careers, I would say that probably certainly more than most in terms of a lot of the change I've had. There were times, every time I kind of potentially would make a move, I would question it and decide whether it's worth it, whether I should kind of stay and maintain and grow in a particular position. I would say for me, even kind of in just changing between jobs, I would say that's something that I haven't regretted it. I've really loved learning along the way, but I've made a really big important point to not leave in bad terms in any organization and to keep relationships open, and to make sure that it's not, because I wasn't satisfied in a position. It was more about what's something I could learn and really grow and build on from my experience. But I would say in general, even to this day, like, really, we all make these types of mistakes and these kind of lessons learned along the way. And in every one of those cases, people are wide open to working with you, helping you learn, and nothing, even at a global 100 Fortune 100 company, they were very, very respectful when those types of situations arose, and they're some of the most cutthroat in that way. So I would say people understand everyone's human. And even when, life gets really, really challenging and really busy, there's going to be some weeks that are harder than most. And that's absolutely normal. So in my experience, lots of those, but I would say, in general, not to worry, even though, of course, I'm a big worrier, but try not to worry as much as you can about that.
Fun. Yeah. And honestly, like, getting to know the way things are done in a new organization, like, there's always going to be that learning curve and navigating the politics and who do you have to talk to first before you can go and do XYZ. And I thought that was such a great example to share because, yeah, I think honestly, no matter where you are at in your career, that can be a challenge still. And I have a kind of mantra to myself that's sort of take a breath, think about it a little bit longer, and then act. Because sometimes it's just you need that, like, extra pause to, like, is there someone else I should have talked to about this first? Yeah, love that. And I'm glad that you've been met with understanding And hopefully that is encouraging to our students here in the room. Okay, well, I'm not seeing any questions in the chat. I don't see any raised hands. We're just about at time. And yeah, I want to just say thank you to you, Glenn, for being here with us for this hour, sharing your experiences, being so open and authentic. I really enjoy these sessions and enjoyed hearing about your journey, and I hope that all the students in this room today got something out of it. As I did mention, and you would have seen, this session was recorded, is being recorded. So if there's anything that you want to go back and watch, it will be posted on our Alumni Office Hour page. And if you thought there were some good tidbits that you want to share with a friend, please feel free to do so. And yeah, we have these sessions throughout every term. So we've got one more session coming up for this fall term on November 20th. And there it is in the chat. You can go register now if you'd like. And we'll be back again with another series in the winter term. All right. If you would like to connect with Glenn, he has said that you can go find him on LinkedIn if you have a question that comes to you tomorrow in the shower. We will put his contact in the chat as well. And please, if you can, fill out our survey. You'll get it from 10,000 Coffees. Just let us know how you felt about the session, so we can keep making these better and better and more valuable to all of you folks. All right. Well, I see some messages of thanks for you, Glenn, coming in through the chat. Thank you all for joining us, and hopefully we'll see you in the next one.
Thank you.